Hello, and welcome back to History in a Nutshell. And today's topic is one that I think a lot of people find quite interesting. I want to talk about the space race, and more specifically about the role lesser-known member states of the space race played in it and within the Cold War more broadly, and how foreign policy trends affect space policy and also affect domestic technology policy. Now, when you think of the space race, you probably think of Sputnik, the program of the Soviet Union to put the first man in space, which of course was successful, with Yuri Gagarin becoming the first man to walk in space. And you probably think of the Apollo missions, which climaxed in the moon landing, and the various technology that fed into them. But you probably might not be aware of the role other countries played in the space race, and the role that various nation states and their respective space programs played in this very, very interesting epoch in technological history. So, for example, the French space program, or the French exploration of space, effectively began in 1952 with the launch of the Véronique rocket from the French Sahara. And upon General de Gaulle's return to power, space exploration became a key theme of French political life, and it was seen as symbolic and synonymous with France's reassertion on the global stage and France's aspiration to sort of great power status and independence of the two main camps within the Cold War. So this can be seen with the formation of CNES, or CNES, the first French space agency, if you will, in 1962. And certainly across de Gaulle's reign, you can see that space exploration played a key role in his thinking. As we've said, it was a sign of France's reassertion and its quest for great power status and symbolic and practical independence from both the USSR and the United States. The Ariane family of satellites have been under construction for some time. They're launched in 1965. Very symbolic because it's a European country launching satellites technologically independent of the two main superpowers. So this is of great significance. It's also worth bearing in mind that space travel is also quite keenly tied with French domestic policy at this point, because it's tied into the need for a research and development state, an R&D state, as France at this time is often described, and the preservation of France as a key focal point of science internationally, and also plays a role in the state-driven modernisation of the French economy and the role that aerospace comes to play within France's domestic economy, with Aerospatiale, now Airbus. So that's something to bear in mind. So also, as the 1960s progress, and as European countries that have been nominal allies of the United States, or indeed close allies of the United States, seek to become more independent, they also, interestingly enough, often develop an interest in their own space exploration programs. For example, if you look at the Federal German Republic, we think back to the 1950s, very close ally of the United States, very committed to NATO. Remember, it's the most eastward of the NATO member states. It borders the DDR, East Germany, with which it's in an intense Cold War rivalry. So at the same time, of course, as the Cold War progresses, West Germany becomes more interested in inter-German relations and less focused on a transatlantic alliance. And at the same time as Germany is doing this, West Germany is doing this, they're also developing an interest in space exploration. So, Willy Brandt, the West German Chancellor, the leader of the Social Democrats, the first Social Democratic Chancellor in Germany's democratic history since 1930. The first member of the Social Democrats to become a chancellor in West Germany, in the Federal German Republic. In the same year, he forms a majority is probably the wrong word because he governs in a coalition, but in the same year that he gains a majority for his Ostpolitik, for his programme of making peace with East Germany and with the USSR and pursuing collective security with the Baltic states to de-escalate the Cold War, it's the same year the Federal German space programme is launched, the DLR. And this sort of comes to prominence in the 1970s with the launch of the Helios satellites, a series of heliocentric satellites, that is, satellites focused on the sun, monitoring them. They get launched in 1976. And so at the same time that West Germany is becoming very assertive economically, in the 1970s with the EEC, with European integration, of which they're a great driver, and at the same time they're pursuing Ostpolitik, Eastern policy, reaching out to the Warsaw Pact member states, namely recognising the DDR, East Germany, as a legitimate state actor, but also recognising borders with Poland, which they previously denied, making formal peace with the USSR, and pursuing trade with them, namely in fossil fuels, as we've seen. We've seen that become very topical recently with the Nord Stream 2. So at the same time they're looking eastwards and looking westwards, becoming more assertive on the world stage. Very interestingly, at the same time they're pursuing a space programme, their own independent space programme. Now, of course, no discussion of the space race would be complete without examining the activities of the USSR, who of course were the first country to put a man in space. And what's interesting is the foreign policy of the Soviet Union is also tied to its space policy. So, for example, in 1965, the USSR launches a supranational space programme, the Interkosmos programme. Now, this is a programme designed by the USSR to help its allies in the Warsaw Pact and its various trading partners and geopolitical partners around the world to develop manned spaceflight capabilities. So, amongst them is India, which of course today is a very major country in terms of space exploration. Now, the Indian Space Research Organisation, ISRO, is actually founded in 1962. And it's tied very much this Nehruvian idea of the state-backed modernisation of India. Remember, India is kept deindustrialised by the British, it's kept underdeveloped by the British, and it remains a very, very poor country under British rule. And of course, when it achieves independence in 1947, it's soon thrust into a Cold War role. It's soon thrust into conflict with Pakistan, and you know it's quite sad, really, that at a stage when it was actually still a largely undeveloped country, it was thrust into this role on the world stage. It was forced to become a regional power, and it was forced to at least try and develop economically very rapidly. And the policy of the post-independence Congress governments, Congress being the party that was the key player in the Indian independence movement and is the dominant party in India really for many decades after independence, there's this concept that what's needed is an almost Soviet-style state-driven modernisation of society and space exploration with the subsequent spin-offs and the subsequent incentives for industrialisation and economic modernisation are seen as a key part of this. So, India joins Interkosmos, and which is symbolic, really, of the close ties that existed between the two during the Cold War. And as we're actually seeing now, which is quite interesting, is that India and Russia are still have quite close bilateral relationships. India is becoming a very key trading partner of Russia, as demand from the EU countries for Russian oil is subsiding. It's actually increasing in India, and India is becoming a very significant export market for Russian fossil fuels. And what's so interesting is I think that ISRO, the Indian space programme, is a really good case study in the way that space programmes can aid in the modernisation of an economy. For example, the ISRO Smart Limbs, a family of prosthetic limbs that emerged as a technological spin-off of the Indian space programme and have become a key high-tech export for the Indian economy. And so there's a real close tie here we see between space exploration and foreign policy. And you're seeing that actually playing out again today. So if you look at the Chinese space programme, now one of the largest in the world, with the various satellite families they have, the various technological processes they've developed, and the impact that has had on their domestic economy, and their ability to develop a high-tech sector, which they now have. And also, if you look at the same thing with India, with the Indian space programme, and the way that's enabled India to develop a high-tech economy and to modernise rapidly, you also see how conflicts between nation states are impacting space travel today. So, for example, you're seeing the United States get more interested in space travel and technological diplomacy as a result with the Artemis programme, the new NASA programme to explore space, to explore the moon specifically, which they're trying to get other countries involved in. So, for example, Brazil, which again has an interest in space exploration, not in part due to the modernisation and the technological spin-offs that space exploration offers, is taking part in the Artemis programme, but at the same time, Brazil's foreign policy and Brazil's foreign doctrines in the contemporary era, ones of what might be dubbed a universalist approach or a sort of active non-aligned approach, is that at the same time Brazil is supporting the Artemis programme, they're also allowing their satellites to be launched by the Chinese, and there's a very close bilateral partnership in space exploration there between China and Brazil. So what can we take away from this? Well, for a start, the space race wasn't just the USSR versus the US. It was a series of countries, or a significant number of countries, with different styles of regime, different constitutional arrangements, within the Cold War context, competing scientifically and technologically, but also trying to develop economically and use their space programs to steer their economy in a technological direction. You're also seeing that today, in which you can see countries' foreign policies, Brazil, the US, India, China, being reflected in their space programs, and the scientific cooperation and the scientific competition that is reflected in them. So, that is really the true story of the space race. It's a series of countries competing and cooperating, and it's the foreign policy decisions of those countries being reflected in their respective space programs. You saw that during the space race of the Apollo era, and in the era of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation. You're seeing it in the modern era. Thank you very much for watching.